everyone, I am Faradia Alicia, a nighttime storyteller, and I'm here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use this video to help you fall asleep, so before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where are you watching from? What time is it where you are? Relax, get comfortable, and let your mind unwind. The sky was covered with thick gray clouds as ADI stepped off the old bus. A cold drizzle fell from the heavens, soaking the ground in a never-ending mist. He pulled his jacket tighter around his body inside. 10 years had passed since he last set foot in this village, but nothing had changed. The same narrow dirt roads, the same moss-covered houses, the same eerie silence that seemed to cling to the air like a ghostly whisper. ADI had left this village when he was 18, seeking a better life in the city. He had sworn never to return, but fate had other plans. His mother had passed away recently, and he was the only one left to take care of their old house. Despite his reluctance, he knew he had no choice. As he walked down the familiar path leading to his childhood home, he noticed something strange. The village felt abandoned. The houses were still standing, but their windows were shut. Their doors bolted as if the people inside were afraid of something lurking outside. There were no children playing in the streets. No old men sitting on their porches smoking tobacco. It was as if the entire village had been swallowed by fear. A sudden gust of wind sent a shiver down ADI's spine. The rain continued to fall lightly, creating small puddles on the uneven ground. He quickened his pace, eager to reach his house before nightfall. Then he saw her. An old woman stood at the corner of the street, her back slightly hunched, her long gray hair damp from the rain. She was watching him intently, her wrinkled face expressionless. "Excuse me, ma'am," ADI said cautiously. "Do you remember me? I'm ADI. I used to live here." The old woman's lips trembled slightly, but she did not smile. Instead, she took a step closer, lowering her voice to a whisper. "You should not have come back, boy." ADI frowned. "What do you mean?" The woman glanced around nervously, as if afraid someone or something was listening. "Leave before night falls," she said, her voice urgent. "Do not step outside after dark. And if the rain falls lightly, do not listen to the voice calling your name." A chill ran through ADI's body. He wanted to ask more, but before he could, the old woman turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of a nearby alley. ADI shook his head. Superstitions. The village had always been full of them. He continued walking, trying to push the strange encounter out of his mind. Soon, he reached his old house, a wooden structure with a slanted roof and faded paint. It looked just as he had left it, worn but sturdy, standing alone at the edge of the village, near the forest. Unlocking the door, ADI stepped inside. The air smelled of dust and damp wood. He dropped his bag on the floor and glanced around. The furniture was covered in white sheets, untouched for years. With a heavy sigh, he began unpacking. The house was silent except for the rhythmic sound of raindrops tapping against the roof. Then, just as he was about to settle in for the night, he heard it, a faint sound, a whisper. Someone was calling his name. ADI. He froze. The voice was distant, carried by the wind, almost blending with the rain. It sounded soft, almost sorrowful. He turned toward the window. The glass was foggy, obscuring the view outside. The street was empty, drenched in silver rain. It was probably his imagination. The old woman's words had unsettled him. That was all. He took a deep breath and shook off the unease, ignoring the lingering fear in his chest. He turned away from the window and headed to bed. As he lay down, the rain continued its endless whisper, and in the distance, beyond the trees, the voice called again, ADI. This time, it was closer. The night was long and restless. ADI lay in bed, staring at the wooden ceiling, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain against the roof. The house creaked occasionally, as if sighing under the weight of time. But what unsettled him most was a voice. It had called his name again. Soft, distant, almost pleading. He told himself it was just the wind, or perhaps a trick of his tired mind. But deep inside, he wasn't convinced. The clock on the wall read 2:13 a.m. when he finally closed his eyes. Morning came with a dull gray sky and the ever-present drizzle. ADI stepped out of his house, stretching his stiff legs. The air smelled of wet earth and decaying leaves. He looked around, hoping to see signs of life. But the village was just as quiet as the day before. He decided to visit the market if it still existed. He needed food, and more importantly, he needed answers. As he walked through the empty streets, he noticed something disturbing. Many of the houses had strange symbols carved into their wooden door circles, crosses, and what looked like crude human figures. He ran his fingers over one of the symbols, feeling the rough grooves beneath his touch. A protection ward, a voice said behind him. ADI turned sharply. A man stood there, his face half hidden under the shadow of a wide-brimmed hat. He looked older than ADI, but not quite elderly, perhaps in his late 40s. His dark eyes studied ADI carefully. Protection? ADI repeated. Against what? The man's jaw tightened. You really don't remember anything, do you? ADI frowned. What are you talking about? The man sighed and gestured for ADI to follow him. Come, you should eat. The market was smaller than ADI remembered. Half the stalls were empty, and the ones that remained were run by villagers who looked pale and tired, their eyes constantly shifting toward the sky, as if expecting something to descend from the clouds. The man led ADI to a small food stall where an old woman was frying bananas. The aroma reminded ADI of his childhood. He ordered some, along with a cup of hot tea, before sitting down across from the man. You lived here once, the man said. You should know the story. ADI took a sip of his tea. I left 10 years ago. If something happened after that, I wouldn't know. The man exhaled sharply. It wasn't after you left. It was before. You just forgot. A strange unease settled in ADI's chest. He was about to ask what the man meant when, suddenly, the atmosphere shifted. The villagers all stopped moving. Their faces went pale, their eyes wide with fear. Then ADI heard it. A cry. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, piercing the air with sorrow and anguish. It was the sound of a woman weeping, carried by the wind. The rain, which had been light before, started falling harder. ADI felt his heart pound against his ribs. The man across from him stood up abruptly. "We need to go. Now." ADI hesitated. "Who is that?" The man grabbed his wrist, his grip firm. "Don't ask. Just move." The weeping grew closer. It was coming from the end of the street, beyond the market. ADI turned his head toward the sound, and then he saw her. A woman stood in the rain, her long, wet hair covering most of her face. She was barefoot. Her white dress stained with mud. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs. But what made ADI's blood turn cold was that none of the villagers looked at her. They kept their heads down, pretending she wasn't there. The man yanked ADI's arm. "Don't look at her." ADI couldn't move. He was frozen in place, unable to tear his gaze away. Then, slowly, the woman lifted her head. Her face was pale, almost translucent. Her eyes hollow pits of darkness. Tears streamed down her cheeks, vanishing into the rain. She opened her mouth, and the crying turned into a scream. The sound was unnatural, shrill and agonizing. It stabbed into ADI's skull like 1,000 needles. The world around him blurred. His vision darkened. Then everything went silent. When ADI opened his eyes, he was lying on the floor of the food stall. The man from before was kneeling beside him, shaking his shoulders. "Are you all right?" the man asked. ADI's head throbbed. His ears were still ringing. He sat up slowly, trying to process what had just happened. "What was that?" he whispered. The man's expression darkened. "That," he said, "was sorry." ADI sat in stunned silence, his mind still reeling from what had just happened. The name sorry felt unfamiliar, yet strangely heavy, as if it carried a history he should have remembered. The villagers were beginning to move again, cautiously returning to their routines. No one spoke of what had just occurred. It was as if the weeping woman had never been there. The man sitting across from ADI's side. "I should have known this would happen. You've been gone too long." ADI finally found his voice. "Who is she? What happened here?" The man hesitated before replying. "My name is Booty," he said, "and if you really want answers, you need to come with me." Booty led ADI out of the market, away from the village center. They walked in silence, the rain continuing its endless drizzle. Soon, they reached the outskirts of the village, where the dirt path split in two. One road led toward the rice fields, and the other, narrower and darker, disappeared into the dense trees of the forest. Booty stopped at the edge of the forest and turned to ADI. "Do you remember this place?" ADI looked at the towering trees, their trunks slick with moisture. Shadows stretched between them, thick and impenetrable. A deep unease crept over him. "No," he admitted. "Should I?" Booty studied him carefully before shaking his head. "Maybe it's better that way." Without another word, Booty stepped onto the forest path. ADI hesitated, but his curiosity pushed him forward. The deeper they walked into the woods, the colder the air became. The rain barely reached the ground here, blocked by the thick canopy above. An eerie silence replaced the sounds of the village. No birds, no insects, just the distant drip of water and the occasional rustle of unseen movement. ADI shivered. "Why are we here?" "To show you the truth," Booty said. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a clearing. In the middle of it stood an old, abandoned house. The wooden structure was blackened with age. its roof partially caved in. Vines had crept over its walls, reclaiming it as part of the forest. The door hung slightly open, creaking softly in the wind. ADI felt his breath hitch. There was something deeply wrong about this house. This, Booty said quietly, is where Sorry lived. They stood at the entrance for a long moment before Booty finally pushed the door open. It groaned in protest, revealing a dark interior that smelled of damp wood and decay. ADI hesitated before stepping inside. Dust covered every surface, and broken furniture lay scattered across the floor. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling like forgotten memories. Booty moved toward an old wooden table, brushing off a thick layer of dust. "Look at this," he said. ADI walked over. On the table lay a small, leather-bound book, its cover cracked with age. "What is it?" ADI asked. "A diary," Booty replied. "Sorry's diary." ADI hesitated before picking it up. The pages were brittle, the ink faded but still legible. He flipped to a random entry and began to read. "July 12th. The rain won't stop. It never stops. Every day, the sky weeps, as if mourning something forgotten. I don't mind the rain, but the nights are getting worse. I hear voices outside my window, whispering my name. I see shadows moving between the trees, but no one believes me. They say I'm imagining things. They say I'm cursed." ADI swallowed hard. He turned to another page. "August 3rd. They came for me today. The villagers. They dragged me from my home, screaming, calling me a witch. They blamed me for the endless rain, for the misfortunes that have befallen this place. I tried to tell them I wasn't responsible, but they wouldn't listen. They took me to the forest. The ink was smeared here, as if the writer's hands had been shaking, buried me beneath the old tree. But I'm still here. I can still hear them, and one day, they will hear me too." ADI felt his stomach drop. "She was murdered," he whispered. Booty nodded grimly. "The villagers accused her of bringing misfortune. They thought if they got rid of her, the rain would stop." ADI clenched his fists, but it didn't. No, Booty's voice was heavy. It only got worse. A sudden gust of wind rattled the broken windows. ADI shivered, suddenly aware of how cold it had become. The shadows in the corners of the house seemed darker now, stretching unnaturally. "We should go," Booty said, closing the diary. "Staying here too long is dangerous." ADI nodded and turned toward the door. And then he heard it. A whisper, soft, distant. ADI, his blood ran cold. Booty grabbed his wrist. "We need to leave. Now." ADI didn't argue. They rushed out of the house, their footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. The moment they stepped outside, the temperature shifted. The air was still cold, but the suffocating heaviness from inside was gone. They didn't stop walking until they were far from the clearing. Finally, ADI broke the silence. "What happens now?" Booty exhaled. "Now, you have a choice." ADI looked at him. "What choice?" Booty's eyes were grim. "You can leave and forget all of this. Or you can help in this curse." The rain continued to fall, whispering against the leaves, and deep in the forest, beneath the old tree, something watched them leave. The rain hadn't stopped since ADI returned to the village. That night, the wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of his childhood home. ADI lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that someone was watching him. The memory of Sari's diary haunted his thoughts. Murdered, accused of witchcraft, buried beneath the old tree. The villagers had done something terrible, and now they were paying the price. And yet, Booty had given him a choice. Leave and forget, or stay and end the curse. ADI turned to the window. The rain was lighter now, falling in thin, silvery strands. He could see the dark outlines of trees swaying in the distance. Then, somewhere in the night, he heard it. A whisper. ADI, his chest tightened. The voice was closer this time, coming from outside his house. Slowly, he sat up and walked to the window. He wiped away the condensation with his palm and peered outside. For a moment, he saw nothing, just the empty street, the flickering glow of lanterns from the neighboring houses. Then, a figure stood beneath a large banyan tree at the end of the road. A woman, dressed in white. Her hair clung to her pale face, drenched from the rain. She was standing unnaturally still, her head slightly tilted, as if listening for something. ADI's breath hitched. He took a step back from the window. Suddenly, the woman moved, not walking, not running. She shifted one moment standing under the tree, the next closer, then closer, and closer, until she was directly in front of his house. ADI's body turned rigid. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The woman raised her hand and placed it against the window pane. A thin, bony hand with fingers too long. Her nails were blackened, broken, and then slowly she lifted her head. Her eyes were hollow pits of darkness, staring straight at him. The glass cracked beneath her touch. ADI stumbled backward just as the candlelight in his room flickered out. And then, silence. When ADI woke up, the sky outside was a pale shade of gray. The candle had burned out completely, leaving only a small puddle of wax. The window was intact, with no sign of cracks or fingerprints. Had it been a dream? No, he knew what he saw. Still shaken, he decided to find Booty. The village was just as lifeless as before. The few villagers he passed refused to meet his gaze. When he asked where Booty lived, they only muttered vague directions before hurrying away. It took him nearly an hour to find the house. It was located at the far end of the village, near the riverbank. The small wooden structure looked as old as the rest of the village, its roof covered in patches of moss. ADI knocked. No response. He knocked again, harder. The door creaked open slightly. Booty? No answer. Swallowing his hesitation, ADI pushed the door open and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of damp wood. A few books and papers were scattered on the wooden table. On the wall, strange symbols had been carved into the surface. Protection wards just like the ones he had seen on the village doors. Then he noticed something else. The diary. Sari's diary lay open on the table, as if Booty had been reading it before he left. ADI stepped closer and glanced at the open page. August 7th. I can feel it. The ground beneath the tree is growing restless. The rain is not mine to control. I never cursed this place, but they would never believe me. Now I am trapped here, forever whispering between the raindrops. But someone will hear me soon. Someone will remember. A cold chill crept down ADI's spine. Sari hadn't cursed the village. Then why was her spirit haunting it? Before he could turn another page, a voice behind him spoke. You saw her, didn't you? ADI spun around. Booty stood in the doorway, his expression grim. She came to you last night. Booty continued. It wasn't a question. ADI exhaled shakily. Yes. Booty walked forward, rubbing his temples as if exhausted. She's getting stronger. What does she want? ADI asked. Booty hesitated before answering. She wants justice. ADI's throat felt dry. How do we give it to her? Booty met his gaze. We have to dig up the truth. Literally. ADI frowned. What do you mean? Booty placed a hand on the open diary and turned to the last page. The handwriting was rushed, desperate. August 10th. They think they've buried me, but the rain washes away their secrets. My body will not rest, because I was never meant to be here. They did not bury me in the village cemetery. They buried me beneath the old tree. ADI felt his blood turn cold. You're saying, he started, but the words caught in his throat. Booty nodded. We need to find her remains. A heavy silence filled the room. Then, from outside, the rain started falling harder, and in the distance, carried by the wind, the whisper returned. ADI. This time, it was no longer pleading. It was waiting. The rain was relentless. It pounded against the earth in an unceasing rhythm, as if the sky itself wept for what had been buried beneath it. ADI and Booty stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the darkness between the trees. The old banyan tree loomed in the distance, its massive roots twisting over the damp soil like the fingers of something long dead but never truly at rest. You are sure about this? ADI asked, gripping the handle of the shovel Booty had handed him. Booty exhaled. It's the only way. ADI swallowed hard and nodded. They stepped forward, disappearing into the forest. The first few strikes of the shovel were easy. The soil was loose, damp from years of rainfall. But as they dug deeper, the earth became heavier, resisting their efforts as if trying to keep its secret hidden. Then, clunk, ADI froze. His heart pounded as he dropped to his knees and brushed the dirt away with his hands. A wooden plank, old, rotting, a makeshift coffin. Booty's face was pale. We found her. ADI hesitated before prying the planks apart. The wood crumbled at his touch, and beneath it, a skeleton. The bones were tangled in what remained of a white dress, soaked in mud. The skull was tilted to the side, as if in silent agony. Long, brittle strands of hair still clung to the decayed form. But the worst part, the body's arms were raised. The fingers were clawing at the inside of the coffin. She had been buried alive. ADI lurched backward, bile rising in his throat. Dear God, Booty clenched his fists. They didn't just kill her. They trapped her. A gust of wind howled through the trees. The temperature dropped. And then, a whisper, you found me. ADI's blood ran cold. Slowly, he lifted his head. Sari stood across from them. She was no longer the ghostly figure he had seen before. Her face was clearer now, young, fragile, streaked with mud and rain. But her eyes, they were empty, a void of sorrow and rage. She stepped forward, her bare feet not touching the ground. They buried me here, she whispered. They left me to die, and now they will pay. The ground trembled. From the darkness of the trees, figures emerged: villagers, the same people who had ignored ADI in the streets. But now their faces were contorted in terror. They fell to their knees, whispering prayers, begging for mercy. One of them, an elderly man, crawled forward. "Sorry," he sobbed. "We were wrong. Please, forgive us." Sorry tilted her head, studying him. Her face was unreadable. Then, she raised her hand. A deafening crack of thunder split the sky. The rain turned to a downpour, drowning out the villagers' screams. ADI shielded his eyes as the wind roared through the forest. He could feel the weight of Sorry's grief, her fury, pressing down on them. "Sorry," he shouted over the storm. "This isn't what you want." She turned to him, her expression flickering: anger, sorrow, confusion. "They hurt you," ADI said. "They stole your life. But this won't bring you peace." Her fingers trembled. The wind faltered. For the first time, she looked uncertain. Booty stepped forward. "We'll bury you properly," he promised. "We'll make sure you're remembered not as a curse, but as someone who was wrong." Sorry's lips parted. A single tear slipped down her cheek, clear. Like the rain, the storm began to calm. The villagers, still kneeling, wept openly. Sorry closed her eyes, and then she faded. The rain slowed to a drizzle. The wind stilled. The night was silent once more. ADI let out a shaky breath. It was over. The next morning, under a clear sky for the first time in years, the villagers gathered to give Sorry a proper burial. A stone was placed at the site. Inscribed was her name. As ADI and Booty stood before her grave, Booty asked, "Are you staying?" ADI watched the villagers, how they looked lighter, freed from their burden. He smiled faintly. "Yeah, I think I will." The Rain Village, once haunted by sorrow, could finally begin to heal.